Hello, and welcome to Andrew Broussard Watercolors. Today, we're going to do a fast and loose watercolor tonalist landscape painting, and I'm going to focus on the concepts that I explored in the previous video. So, I'm going to introduce the material, then I'll talk about the concepts. Quarter sheet Stonehenge Aqua, 100% cotton, 140-pound cold press. I'm going to be using a variety of Cotman, Van Gogh, and Da Vinci brand paints. I'll name the colors as I use them. And I'll be painting mainly with the hake brush, and that's the Ranson hake brush. And I'm thoroughly saturating my paper. So the concepts in the previous video, I played around with something that I think was described by Burge Harrison, 1908, 1909 book. He was a tonalist landscape painter and a educator. And Carlson, I'm not sure what Carlson's first name was, but Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, 1920 was when that book came out. The concept is that darker tonal values over a light background will appear lighter if the object is thinner, and if the object is thicker, it's going to appear darker. So I'm going to use that as I create the scene. From there, I don't have too much of an idea in mind in regards to the landscape layout and the composition, but we'll kind of make it up as we go along. I'm going to go wet and wet, and then use the approach that the oil painters, the tonalist oil painters, Stuart Davies and Dennis Sheehan use, where they're putting out a wet mix of their oils, in this case watercolor here, and pushing back and forth, creating our scene. And once again, no fresh pigments are out, so it's probably going to appear lighter, and I'm probably going to have to go a little bit rougher. This is the raw sienna. We'll create our white background. I'll use this spot for my light area, and I'll omit putting pigment there. Some pigment that made its way onto the wood in previous paintings is taking place and occurring. Let's try to do a path. I usually do waterways. I think this one, I'll just have a path that's receding. Grab a mixture of raw sienna and ultramarine. Get a gray going. That'll be the path. Making it very triangular. From that, I'll play around with those edges. Let's grab some burnt sienna. Use that to warm my foreground. Do my horizon line back here. Looks like I'm only going to do raw sienna in the sky. Let's get light red oxide and ultramarine mix. This is a distant purple. This recipe is one that I picked up from James Fletcher Watson. Far distant tree line. Let's grab a little bit stronger mix. And I'll feed that into the lower portion. You can see it's more on the ultramarine side of things. Okay. I can use this mix to start making out the road. I really don't paint roads that often. Conceptually, I like to paint things that could kind of take place in any time period. But roads and paths, I think they're acceptable. I just don't really put them in often. Some raw sienna, stronger mix. Either side of this path. Stronger light red oxide and ultramarine. My light's coming from back here. We'll probably have a big old tree that we're going to experiment with the tonal variety. And I do want some background trees. So here's the number 1 rigger. Just going to dab in some taller trees back in here. So it's all wet and wet. It should dry to a nice soft look. Maybe a taller group of trees in this region just to block the eye. Now with the tree themselves, the larger trees, I'm going to map it out in the wet and wet stage. Something I'm kind of reluctant to do, mainly because of the whole the bleeding and the softening that'll take place with it. But I do plan to go a lot into this tree or this tree line, so we'll just let it happen. We'll see. So the idea is that my thinner lines, my thinner branches and trunks are going to be soft, kind of capture some of that glow. That light will surround the edges of them. And when we dry off, I'll then pass over, not the exact same spots, but we'll paint branches in, and that will create even more depth. We could put a little bit of foliage in. The idea that I'm trying to keep in mind is that smaller densities of foliage, light would pass through and catch all the leaves and give a glow to it. while thicker patches will have less light passing through to hit all the leaves, and therefore less glow. Base, I'll have its shadow. Grab some Payne's Gray, just as an easy go-to dark. It's going to cast its shadow here. I did find in the previous painting that in the wet and wet stage, I'll often use Payne's Gray on the edge of water, but we don't have like a stream or river here. I'm trying to do the path. But mapping out areas that are going to be dark with that Payne's Gray did help. So I'm adding a little darker aspect of things. Now this hake brush is quite worn, so that's why it has all this weird shape and texture to it. Grab some raw sienna for a little bit of glowing foliage. Okay. Going back in with the number 1 rigger. Put some more trunks and branches and trees. Then we are going to do a dry off. The paper is super saturated still, so things are going to move around. When I do the dry off, I'm going to do it off camera. I'm going to pause the camera. But I'm going to hold my blow dryer pretty high up and far away and go on a slow, low setting so that it's not pushing this pigment all over the place. And then once you get it to the point where it's still wet but not pushing pigment around, then you can kind of kick up the blow dryer a notch and bring it closer. Just seeing if there's anything else to explore in this wet and wet stage. Raw sienna. Okay. I'm going to pause and I'm going to do the dry off. All right, some areas are a little damp, but we're pretty much out of the wet and wet phase. So I'm going to grab the number 4 rigger. This just lets me hold more pigment and kind of do thicker lines if need be. And I'm going to grab my ultramarine, burnt umber, getting that gray mix. I'm not going to pass over the pre-existing lines. Just creating another layer. Now the goal here is twofold. To build up the depth and using tonal values to do that, while also allowing my thicker lines to have a darker tonal value. To try to get a sense of reality in this fast and loose painting. I'm just letting it go. I think twigs and branches are one of the harder parts of watercolor painting for me, mainly because of the potential tediousness of them. And if you watch a lot of the videos, you'll often see that I'll do some of this off camera just because of that slightly time-consuming aspect. Using the side brush. Start creating kind of a dappled effect of the shadows here. What I'm going to do is warm it up with burnt sienna as it gets closer. Give a little directional shape. Play around foliage on this stage. Let's see if we could go even lighter. This is one of the intricacies of the hake brush, is that whenever you want to water down whatever you're putting in, you're then changing the way the hake is going to act. So you got to pull a lot of that moisture out. There we go. Kind of just a lighter, softer level to mimic the lighter softness of these branches and trunks. And ultramarine, burnt umber for some darker aspects. Trying to get that to come forward in the picture plane. These guys rise up, grab the edges. I'm going to bring a branch out far out here. The illusion of just grass and texture. And what I'm going to do is dry off so we can do our next layer. Okay, I should add, before we go any further, that now we're kind of at a stage of personal preference where you might see paintings referred to as high key or low key, meaning darker in the tonal variety, high key being lighter and brighter. And I believe that this one would be considered a high key currently, where it's bright and light. And you might have a preference where you want to leave it at this. And I'm sure there's like house colored schemes that are at this lighter level. I usually like the darker, moodier key. That being said, I also like to see if we can have white and then super dark. So I'm going to continue with the experiment now, pushing this in the darker direction. I'm using the number 4 rigger. I'm putting in thicker lines now. The number 4 holds the more pigment, like I said earlier, and it's just easier for me in the fast and loose approach. The idea is twofold. As we come closer in the picture plane, I just use kind of atmospheric perspective where things are going to be darker in value as they come closer. But I'm also going to try to keep in mind that edge concept that I talked about, the thickness of the lines changing. Just continuing that dappled shadow effect. Warming it up with some burnt sienna. Might be a little too much. Bring a little bit of grass in this edge. It almost feels like a vignette with how soft everything is. So these branches closer to us, still lighter tonally because of their thinness. Maybe I'll put a big old branch that'll connect to that, or a big old tree trunk in the next layer. And if you have the patience for it, do the number 1. Let's see. This is Payne's gray, so we're getting a little bit darker values in there. So what I'll do now is grab a little bit of stronger foliage, so raw sienna. I think light red oxide, we'll use that in here as well. It's almost like my approach to some clouds in some previous paintings, where it was the raw sienna, wet and wet, then light red oxide to push a little bit of a reddish glow in them, and then Payne's gray to then move a little bit towards the darker shadows in the clouds. I'm going to use that same concept here. All right, raw light red oxide. Just trail off on either side. Right, I'm going to grab some Payne's gray. Kind of hit the under portions, the shadow areas. And since this is fast and loose and imaginary, I believe that just simply varying your density and having a randomness to it will hopefully achieve more of a realistic aspect. Okay, let's pause for a dry off. I'm going to do another layer. I think I'm going to introduce a new color into this one now. Phthalo blue. The phthalo blue mixed with the burnt umber gives a fantastic dark. You can go with ultramarine blue and the burnt umber and mix Payne's gray into that if you want. You could also do ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. If you follow Jane Blundell, she mixes that up, pre-mixes it in pans, and named it Jane's Gray, that mixture. Okay, so this guy's closer, so you can see I started him lower on the picture plane, but I'm also going to bring a little bit of thicker aspects to him. So just using kind of a perspective trick to make it look bigger and closer. And then I'm going to pass some water along the edges just to widen it and also try to get that variety that I was talking about, where the thicker objects will be darker and might have a lighter edge where the light hits. Try not to repeat too many similar background patterns. Let's come up and out. Kind of just taking a chance. This fella, grounding him. Okay, so he's going to be, thinner branches are still going to be lighter in tonal value. If you have a light hand, you can get a lot done with the number 4. I am not at that stage. I don't know if I'll ever get that light. I paint very vertical trees. I made that observation in the previous video. Payne's Gray. I think Payne's Gray is the only fresh paint I poured out. I used so much of it. A little bit darker, just to get that total variety over it. Mix a little bit of light red oxide in it, kind of warm it up some. Do that dappled shadow. My idea is bring it out as a triangle, so it's getting larger, the shadow, as it gets closer to us, because we're getting more on top. Also causes perspective trick right there, and we're also going a little bit warmer as we get closer. Once again, I rarely ever paint roads, but that's the kind of approach that I'm putting there. Got a little bit of foreground bush right here. I don't know if I mentioned in this one, you are more than welcome to follow along. And anytime you follow along with one of my paintings, you are more than welcome to sign your own name. And you have express permission to sell anything you do when you follow one of my tutorials or experiments. I want you guys to be successful. I want you to have fun and you know, be able to afford art supplies. And even if you're not selling them, if you're just giving them away to friends and family, that's perfect. If you go into a lot of people's houses, you'll see they have paintings hanging up. Not really from famous artists, but from a great aunt or a great grandma in the family, or a great uncle or grandpa. So art holds a lot of value to your loved ones if you did it. Let's go a little bit darker with the foliage now, or a little bit stronger. Raw sienna. I think we went light red oxide, so we'll go with that again. Then we can grab some Payne's gray. We have little openings in the trees and the foliage. I think people refer to them as bird holes. Let's see. Let's now do another layer of branches over this, and I think we'll call it at that. I think it can be pushed further. A few things to think about while I'm just mixing this up. The background, when we had done our first layer of trees, and we did them really nice and soft, if you want, you can create some background trees in that, like right here, back in this region in that fashion. In fact, let's lighten this up, water it down. If you want. There we go. A little bit pine tree-ish. You can play around with different symbolic shapes, representational ideas. That's what I was kind of gearing towards on this side. It's just a good way to experiment and get ideas is to look at the Hudson River Valley painters of the 1800s, their background trees, their horizon lines, kind of see how they layered them and got an idea of perspective and depth back there. Using the heel of the brush, a few different techniques and experiments back here. You could even grab the number 1. Put some branches and trunks in. Not that you would see everything, but might help you out. Yeah, makes for an interesting background. You could also use the light washes and put in buildings and other fun stuff back there. All right, last dry off and we'll sign it. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope it gave you some ideas and inspired you to try some different stuff. If you follow along, feel free to tag me on social media or send me a message. If you want to support this channel, I have the Etsy, I have Patreon, the YouTube where you can donate, etc. Appreciate all your support and kind words, and you all take care and have a great day.